Today we're back working on the 1 litre EcoBoost. It's been a couple of weeks since you saw me do any work on this engine, but that's because the weather was actually quite nice over Christmas. It warmed up quite a bit, so I thought I could actually get a few jobs done outside on the ST. But now that it's miserable outside, I've decided it's time to come back in and carry on working on this engine. If you've seen the last video of me working on this engine, you'll know that we removed the turbo, the exhaust, we removed the inlet manifold, and we also removed all of the auxiliary pieces. So we removed the AC compressor, we removed the alternator, the water pump, and all that sort of stuff. Then I worked on getting a few little bits like hoses and things off the top of the engine, and then we removed the rocker cover so that we've got access to the head bolts, because in this video, I'm hoping to be able to remove the cylinder head. But it's actually quite complicated to do on these engines. There's a lot of work involved. There's a lot of different steps you need to take, because the crank on these, not only is the bolt really tight, but it's also a keyless crank. So you need to make sure it's all timed up and locked in place before you remove anything. So that's what I'm going to be working on first. Now, before we get started, there is just one thing I'd like to ask you guys to please bear in mind, especially if you're new here. And that is that, guys, I'm not a mechanic. I'm just a DIY enthusiast that loves cars. I love working on them and finding out more about how they actually work. So if you see me removing a part that you're thinking, why the hell did you remove that? You don't need to remove that to do this job, or, oh, you've done that wrong, and you're one of those people that just wants to leave a horrible comment to say something about it, then just bear in mind that I'm doing this because I want to learn as well as show you guys the process of what I'm doing. I'm not claiming this particular series is a how-to by any means, because I've never worked on an engine like this. I've never even taken an engine out of a car before. But I'm the kind of person who's willing to just send it and see. I think there's so much bad attitude towards people trying to work on their own cars when they're not 100% sure of what they're doing. Yes, granted, you shouldn't go out and change your brakes if you don't know how to do it and then go and drive it, because it might not be safe. But if you've got access to another car or just a wrecker engine or something like that, that you can just have a go at, I highly encourage you to do that, because I'm learning a hell of a lot from working on this engine. And to be honest, I've picked quite a hard one to start with. I wouldn't pick one of these if I were you. So if you see me doing something wrong or see me removing something that I didn't necessarily need to remove, then just bear in mind that I'm going as deep as I can with this, just to learn more and more about how this engine actually works. Yes, granted, if I'm doing something wrong, I would like to know, so be sure to let me know in the comments, but be nice about it. That being said, when I take on something like this, I make sure I do my research, because I wouldn't just want to fly into this completely blind. So after my last video, a lot of people suggested that I would need a timing kit for this and also a torque multiplier. Like I mentioned in the last video, this whole side of the engine is one big timing cover which you need to remove. And to get that cover off, you need to get the crank pulley off. That bolt is ridiculously tight, so that is why people say you need a torque multiplier. But like I said at the start of this video, this is a floating crank. There's no key on it. So as I understand it, once we take that bolt out, there's nothing to make sure the crankshaft stays in the right position relative to the cams, especially because we're going to be removing and changing the timing belt as well. So there is a special tool that you need to lock all that in place. So I've gone ahead and picked up that tool. So this is the timing toolkit that we need to make sure this engine is in time and everything's locked in place. And I've also picked up one of those torque multipliers. Now, obviously, those of you that were shouting at me in the last video saying you need the torque multiplier are going to be raging at this, seeing that piece of metal bar. But for those of you that don't know what a torque multiplier is or don't know what I'm on about, that is not it. That is just a long piece of metal bar that I'm going to use as an extension for my breaker bar. But basically, a torque multiplier, as the name suggests, just multiplies the torque you apply to a bolt, increasing it and hopefully getting it off a little bit easier. But the one from Ford is, I think, about £800, but there are replica versions for more like £500. But either way, I wasn't going to spend that on this when that's, you know, half the price of what it would cost to just throw a whole engine in there. So we're going to give it a go. Like, it's just a torque spec. I know people are probably going to say, oh, there's a proper sequence and all that sort of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's one bolt. It can't be that difficult. If I can find out the actual torque spec at each stage of the sequence as well, if that's what it needs, then I'm sure we can do it. We just need a massive torque wrench. Like, I know there's going to be people that are shouting at me because of this, but it can be done, trust me. As for this metal bar, all I'm really going to use that for is more leverage to undo the bolt. Undoing the bolt is the bit that I'm worried about for today, because apparently that thing is super tight. So we're just going to use that to get it off. When we come to put this back together, I will use a new crank bolt and all the new bits that I do need to do it. Don't worry about that. But I work with some mechanical engineers and they have suggested that it is literally just going to be a torque. It's just that to make the job easier, Ford use a torque multiplier. There will be a specific torque we need for this, which we can set and we can get it to the right torque. And then if we put it all back together, we go on one drive and it blows up, well, like I said earlier, we send it and see. If that happens, we'll just get another engine and throw that in. That's just what we do. In order to time up the engine and lock the crankshaft in place, I first had to reinstall the flywheel. But unfortunately, with the flywheel in place, the engine just won't go on the engine stand because the bracket that holds it to the stand doesn't clear the flywheel. So I just had to lower the engine back down onto a tyre, and then I could time up the engine. Okay, so the first thing to do is install the crankshaft setting pin, which is this one here, and it goes in here. This is just a blanking plug, so I'm going to remove that. And then I could install the setting pin. But we actually don't want to install that just yet. So let's back that out. And first we need to make sure everything is in the right position. This hole in the crankshaft pulley needs to be at 1 o'clock relative to the central bolt. So it actually needs to be up here. We also need to make sure the camshafts are in the right position. These little spots here are the locating points for the camshaft. So there's basically 3 flats. So there's a flat here, and there's a flat underneath here. And then as you can see, that bottom side there's no sort of smooth, shiny flat spot. So that definitely needs to be on the bottom. Same with this one here, you can see it's in a similar orientation. So we need to rotate the engine to make sure that the crankshaft and the camshaft are in the right position before we put that locking pin in the engine. So I'm going to rotate the crankshaft until these flat spots line up. And the hole in the pulley is, well, just between 12 and 1 o'clock. Then we can install the crankshaft setting pin. The instructions then say to try and rotate the crankshaft until it contacts that pin. There we go. The next thing we need to do is lock the flywheel in place with this tool. It gets bolted into the aperture where the starter motor normally sits. And then this piece slots in between the teeth on the flywheel, locking it in place. And then the bolt on the back can be tightened so that the locking tool doesn't move. Now the next thing according to the instructions is to remove the auxiliary components. So the AC compressor, the auxiliary belt, the alternator. But we've already done that, we did that in the last video. So the next job is to remove that crank pulley bolt, which I'm really nervous about, but we're gonna send it and see if we can get it off. So here is my extremely primitive setup and extension, but we've got to try something. I'm not spending £800 on a torque multiplier. That's just not happening. So we're going to try it like this. Now I'm aware that the engine is going to want to try and turn it over, so I need longer legs. So it's really hard to stop the engine rocking while I'm trying to do this. So I've switched it around. I've shifted it all that way a little bit. See if I can stand on this corner and then I really need someone pushing back that way on the engine. It's just sliding across the floor now. Okay, so it's having no luck in here because the engine was just sliding around all over the cardboard. So I've brought it into my hallway, which is nice and narrow, and I've braced the engine against both walls with some bits of wood, just to try and hold it steady while I try and undo that bolt. So let's see how this goes. Okay, I've spun it round because before I was kind of lifting the engine up, and I think that's what was ruining me. So hopefully, let's try and twist. Oh, what was that? Oh, I think we might have loosened it. I think we might have done it, yes! Oh, yes! Well, there we go. My rudimentary torque multiplier actually worked. And the bracing system as well. I'm actually really happy with how this turned out. I had high hopes for it to start with, and then when it started twisting, even with the wood on here, I thought, nah, I've got no chance. So I'm going to have to figure something else out. But we've got it loose, so I'm going to drag this engine back into here, and then we can carry on. Okay, so I've got the engine back where it was before. Now it's time to finally remove that crank pulley. So I can get the bolt off. First, before I do anything, I have just made a little mark on the pulley and a little mark on the side of the engine cover, just so I know where this actually was when it came off. Because like I said earlier, this is keyless, so just want to make sure it goes back on the same way it came off. Wow, the size of that. I will have to get a new one of these because it says you're not to reuse these, so we'll make sure I get a new one of these, providing we can actually save this engine, which is pretty much the whole purpose of why I'm doing this. Okay, that's the pulley off. There's our crankshaft oil seal, which we'll be replacing as well. Oh, and there's something I forgot to remove before. That is the inlet and exhaust VVT solenoids. So I've just labelled those up so I know which one's which. And I'm just going to remove those quickly, and then we can try and get this timing cover off. Okay, so now I'm ready to go ahead and remove the timing cover. Now, there's 20 bolts that hold the timing cover on. They're all different sizes, all different lengths. So it's important that I make sure I know which one's which and where it goes when it goes back in. So I've drawn myself a little diagram of the timing cover, and I've numbered all the bolts that are on here. And as you'll notice straight away, all the numbers are in no sort of order, or it doesn't really make sense. But that's because in the guide, there is an order because there's a specific tightening sequence when you put this back on. And it also details what torque each of the little bolts gets done to and in what order. So I've made a diagram that matches that sequence, and I know exactly which bolt is which. And then I've just made a little strip for each bolt, which I'm going to wrap around the bolt with a number on, so I know exactly which one is which when I come to put this back together. So I started by just going around all 20 bolts and loosening them slightly in the opposite order to how you tighten them up. So I went back from number 20 all the way down to number 1. Next, in the same reverse order, I backed out each bolt one at a time, wrapping its little numbered piece of tape around it so I knew exactly which bolt was which. Okay, so all the bolts are out and all labelled up. Now, let's see if we can pry this timing cover off. Okay, it is starting to come slowly, but I'm just trying to be really careful not to damage any of these like sealing surfaces because there's not really anywhere to pry. If I stick anything in there and try and pry either way, it's just going to come up against this surface and damage this. There are two little spots, so there's just a gap in there where you can pry because that doesn't actually seal. It's just like a space between the two bits of metal, and the same on this side. So I am just sticking a screwdriver in there and just prying quite lightly, and you can see that is starting to come away. Like, it is nearly there now, so I'm just going to keep going. I've given it a couple of taps with a rubber mallet as well just to help it on its way, but it is coming. We'll get it off in just a sec. Oh, yes, we are off. Okay, so the timing cover is off. Now, before we go any further, I just want to say a massive shout out and thank you to airborne_globe_trotter. Ollie on Instagram has been back and two with me for the best part of an hour, talking me through the procedure for not only getting the timing cover off, because there was a few bits I just wasn't quite sure of, but also for making sure that I actually had the cams and the crankshaft in the right place, which luckily I do. So I am pretty much ready to go on this. Now, I thought I had to lock the cams in place and it would just come off with the head, but you can't get to the head bolts with the cams in place. So I am going to have to take both camshafts out. So timing belt's going to come off, then the cams are all going to have to come off. So I'm going to have to take off all these little bearing covers so that I can get those off. Now, it's important to make sure that all these little caps that come off here and the bolts go back in exactly the same place because they're machined to fit exactly where they are. So it's important not to get any of these mixed up. So I'm going to make sure all these come off in order, and Ollie reminded me of that as well. So again, massive thanks, mate. I really appreciate all your help with this. Just quickly, it's probably worth noting, if I was just doing the timing belt on this, like if I knew that was all I was replacing, then I would want to lock the cams in place just using this tool here, and there's another one to go on the other camshaft. They basically just seat on top of those flat spots like I was talking about before, and then you can adjust this to make sure it locks in place, and you can actually bolt them to the head as well. But like I said, the cams have got to come out, so we're not going to be using those for this. You would use those though if you weren't taking the head off like I am, and you were just replacing the timing belt. Right, okay, let's get this timing belt off. So again, speaking to Ollie, I could just remove the whole tensioner unit because we're going to be replacing that anyway. But if you do want to actually set this, it's easier with two people. But if you apply enough tension to the belt, you can see that this will eventually line up there, and then there's a little locking pin just to go through there. So I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to do that, you know, I don't know if I'm strong enough. Yeah, I haven't got that. Looks like we're going to be whipping the pulley off. Okay, there we go. One timing belt removed. So the next step was to remove the camshaft bearing caps. I started by loosening each one a little bit at a time, working my way from the outside inwards so as not to put too much uneven stress on the camshafts. Once the bearing caps were loose and no longer putting any strain on the camshafts, I wound the bolts out the rest of the way just using my impact gun. But I made sure to leave the bolts inside the caps so I could lift these off one at a time and lay them out in the order and the orientation that they came off the engine. Next, the camshafts could come out, and I laid everything in a cardboard box, just laid out, like I said earlier, in the correct orientation so I know where everything needs to go when this goes back together. Okay, so the cams are off, and now we've got access to the head bolts, so we can finally remove the head and find out just how much damage there actually is. And ultimately, I guess, how much it's actually gonna cost to repair this engine, if we can repair it at all. But I've hit another stumbling block. So last night I went to try and remove these head bolts. So we put that in there, and you can't actually get it in because the outside of the socket gets stuck in the head and you can't actually get down to the bolts. So this morning I went out and got a set of what we all need, and that is some longer bits. Still won't fit. So it turns out, right, I went out and got these, just longer Torx bits. These are not Torx. They look like a Torx. I don't know if you can quite see. They are 6-point. A lot of people on Facebook said, oh no, they're a spline. They're not. They're definitely a 6-point. But it turns out there's another type of bit beside a Torx that has 6 points, and it's called a ribe bit, I believe, R-I-B-E. Never heard of them before, but basically it's just like a Torx, but rather than the ends like having a point on them, like each spline, I suppose, having a point, it's actually got a flat on the end, like the end's squared off, which to me makes a lot of sense in terms of it's probably less likely to round than a Torx. But I mean, come on, another type of bit that is, as far as I know, fairly uncommon. I'm sure they have been used plenty of times on other things, but I've never heard of one before. Now I know, but it's just another thing that's pushed me back, another tool I've got to order. But for today, I am just going to see if I can smash a 55 Torx into those head bolts and see if I can wind them off that way, because, I mean, the bolts are going to get replaced anyway, so fingers crossed I can do it that way. But if not, looks like we've got to wait, and I'm going to have to order some more tools. So I tried hammering in a T55 Torx bit, but it didn't go in far enough and it just twisted out. So instead, I decided just to try a T50, and I actually managed to get the T50 in there. It was a little bit loose, but it didn't round, and I actually managed to undo all the bolts. So same as with the cams, I worked from outside to in, just loosening each bolt in a crisscross pattern a little bit at a time, and then eventually winding them all the way out with my impact gun. Okay, moment of truth. Let's find out what killed this engine. Okay, so straight off the bat, I'm not actually seeing anything which is particularly standing out to me. There's a lot of like contamination or something around here, but I mean, the gasket seems to be completely intact. Like, I can't see an obvious leak, especially not between any of the cylinders and the coolant jackets or anything like that. So I don't know, it seems really strange. Also, just taking a quick look at the head again, I can't see any immediate signs of any damage, no cracking or anything like that. So you never know, maybe we've got away with this, but also maybe this isn't the reason it wasn't starting. But I mean, there was definitely a leak to the cooling system, so there's definitely something going on. I'm going to remove the gasket, I'm going to clean everything up and just see if I can get a better look at what's actually going on here, and then show you if I can find anything. Okay, so I've cleaned up the head and I've had a closer look with the best straight edge that I've got. Like, I know this isn't going to be a very accurate way of checking that the head is straight, but I've just used that as a rough guide, and from what I can see, there is a few gaps as I go across it, so I think possibly the head is warped. As for the gasket, I'm really not sure. There doesn't seem to be any damage to the gasket at all. Like, there's no clear breaks in it at all. There's no areas where it looks like it's got any damage. Like, it's obviously looking a bit rough, but I mean, they always do. But yeah, nothing I can see that's obvious there. There was one thing that kind of surprised me a little bit. So looking at, I assume these are the coolant jackets. So there's these two here, but then there isn't any others. There is obviously marks in the gasket from where those coolant jackets actually are in the head, but they're only on one side of one cylinder on the gasket. But I've had a look at other gaskets, like replacement ones online, and they seem to be the same. So I can't see that that's going to be anything to do with it, but like, it just doesn't really make sense as to why, you know, you've got all those coolant jackets in there and just, you know, the one set in the gasket. I'm sure someone can clear that up for me and let me know why that is. Like, I'm sure there's a perfectly good reason for it, but it just seemed a bit strange to me. I'm hoping that the block is actually okay. There doesn't really seem to be too much wrong there, but there's no sort of cracks or anything like that in any of these parts. Like, the head looks intact from what I can see. I mean, as I said, it may be warped. I will get that double checked, but as for any sort of like cracks or damage or anything like that, then I can't really see anything. Okay, just quickly to jump back to the gasket, after speaking to a few people and after doing a little bit more research, I think the gasket might actually be our culprit. I'm not sure how well it's going to come across on camera. Like, obviously this is a multi-layered gasket, but you can just see how there's kind of like a bit of ripple between the layers. Like, so if I squeeze those layers together, you can see that, you know, there's a little bit of ripple between the layers there, and it's the same, it's between these two cylinders, and it's the same between these two cylinders. Like, you can just see, I don't know if I'll be able to get it to come across on camera, but like, even when it's flat like this, you can see, like, there you go, you can just sort of see there's clearly like two marks there where I think it's been leaking in the middle, because that's where that little like ripple is in that layer of metal, and it's the same there. So that would really make sense as to why we were getting a leak. And also, I remember when we did the leak down test on this, I remember from the video me actually saying that I could hear the leak not only to the cooling system, but also once I was testing one cylinder, I could actually hear it going through and coming back out the other cylinder, which is what made me think we actually had damage to the head. But I actually think it's those gaps in the gasket between the cylinders that were causing that. So after doing a bit more research and speaking to a few people, I think the head gasket may well have actually been our issue and what was causing that leak. Luckily, we don't seem to have any cracks in the head or in the block. It remains to be seen whether or not anything is warped, but I will make sure I get the head checked out and skimmed if necessary, if they think I can actually save it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the cylinder head down to a local machine shop who are going to check that out for me and pressure test it as well and see if we can actually save this head. If we can, then I'll probably get the block checked out as well, because I want to make sure that if I am going to rebuild this engine, that I do everything properly and I give myself the best chance of actually getting it to work. So I'm sorry I haven't got a definitive answer for you today on exactly what caused it, but I'm pretty sure that the head gasket is likely to be the culprit. It remains to be seen whether or not we've got any warping on the head, but hopefully the head and the block are savable and we can use those and we can rebuild this engine. So we are one step closer to getting this Mark 7 back on the road. But for this video, unfortunately, it is time to end. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.